smooth and easy. It didn't say anything to me. Did it say anything on you guys end when I hit the recording? It says it's recording, so I'm gonna guess that it is. And if not, we'll just have to travel, hopefully. So the primary focus of today, I wanted to work on use cases. I put up a use case page and I went ahead and put in the primary use case that I work on. And I wanted to see though, if there are some other use cases that perhaps I'm not aware of that are really important to folks, and make sure that we get those captured as well. I didn't flesh it out fully because I think that would be part of what we do as a group. But I did put in some key points for that one. But I thought perhaps a better starting place for Dave would be looking at the current approaches that you guys have already put into the wiki, and just sort of running through them real quick so that we get sort of an idea of where we are right now. And then that would sort of give us an idea of like, well, I assume there were some kind of use cases that you were trying to meet as you created those APIs. And so that might help influence some of our discussion about use cases in general. I'm going to say this to do that. And I would say that if folks hear things that would be good to have notes on, if anyone wants to edit this, the meeting page where the notes are, that would be fantastic. I think most of our editing today will probably happen in the documents themselves. I'm going to go ahead and open up both of them so they're just ready for us to go. What I thought we might do is have each person talk about theirs, because you know much more about it than I do. I'm going to go ahead and talk about the Agribot use case, just because that's one that we use here, and there's not anyone from Agribot actually representing their work. So Agribot does a JSON LD through a SCOS ontology, and so they have the search URL, and basically they've done everything as SCOS. And that makes it pretty easy to navigate. It's not a deeply complex ontology where you have to do a bunch of dereferencing and moving through blank nodes. And from a consumer perspective, that is something that has been very easy to work with. So I would say that that's like one of the primary things about Agribot, and maybe one of the decision points that they made. It makes navigating up and down the hierarchy of terms actually quite easy. So we don't actually have any representation by Getty, but I don't know if Rob wants to say something from it as a former Getty person.
So the Getty, I need to remind myself always not to say we anymore. Getty provides its vocabularies as in many different ways, from XML and sort of dumped relational tables through to linked open data, which is the way that we're looking at, the Getty is looking at standardizing on moving forwards. The linked open data structure is based on SCOS, but one of the original design requirements was that all of the information that the Getty maintains about the concept should be expressed in the linked open data description. So the contractor that did it went to great lengths to fulfill that requirement that was given to him, resulting in a wholly unusable mess from my perspective. So one of the more recent activities that has gone on at Getty was to cut down the amount of data into a more useful profile, and to re-express the information using a more CUL-IT CRM oriented ontology rather than SCOS because the museum world uses CUL-IT CRM, and hence to have to jump back and forth between SCOS and CRM makes things more complicated than it needs to be. So for each concept in AAT, you can get two different representations, the complex SCOS version and the simplified CRM version. And in the future, I believe they want to have a simplified SCOS version as well in order to integrate with SCOS-based ontology systems, vocabulary systems. Then so that's just for AAT. There's also TGN and ULAN, which are places and people respectively. And the original design was, again, to use SCOS and custom vocabularies. More recently, following the same logic as for AAT, that it's easier to work within a single ontology, TGN and ULAN have been re-expressed as CUL-IT CRM, which indeed makes significantly more sense to everyone because now the person is a real person, not the concept of a person. And the place is the place, not the concept of the place. So there was a lot of confusion in the wild about what the ULAN, for example, entity represented. Even though the documentation was pretty clear, it said this is a concept, and if you want the actual person, then you need to use this other URI. Everyone just used the concept as if it was a person. So we had a lot of concepts that performed activities, and that, of course, destroyed any useful inferencing or even validation of the data, because clearly concepts can't actually do anything. So in terms of scoping for this group, this is why I suggested last week, the last call rather, that we stick to concepts and not to people to avoid that distinction between the idea of a person and an actual person, or the idea of a place and the actual place. Is that the sort of information that you were looking for, Lynette?
Yes, I just want to I definitely am looking for things like the tidbit where you were saying that you found challenges around people using a concept versus the actual representation of a person. Because I think those are some of the problem points that might be sticking points later. So pulling on people's experience around those, I think, is actually a really good thing to highlight as we go through.
Cool, great. Yeah, and then as the other point, I guess, is that when trying to use data across ontologies, it becomes more complicated because the one ontology is expecting in CRM's case, an E55 type, but SCOS is providing a SCOS concept, so any validation or data generating or data consuming system doesn't know what's going on at that point. So we tried to keep the ontologies consistent as much as possible, and to be able to ask using content negotiation for different representations of the same knowledge using different ontologies. So if you want SCOS, you get SCOS. If you want CRM, you get CRM.
As opposed to mixing them together.
Exactly.
Great. Hetty, you want to talk about ISNI?
Sure, yes. I added today another URL to the list that is on top, because in the first place I thought I should specify a search API for ISNI, and we have only the SRU search API, which has a linked data format in a pre-release version shown in this link. But as you put up your use cases for today, I realized that it's also important to put our the URL going directly to the JSON of an identifier in our ISNI ontology. And so that's why I added the second example with the JSON LD extension at the end.
And in that case, Hetty, that's for a particular term. Is that correct?
Exactly. That's
term.
If you go to the URI of the person, and not if you don't want to use a search API using some name or some key on which you want to search. If you want to use a search name or a search key, you go to the SRU search API, and if you know the ISNI, you go to the direct link for the JSON LD presentation. What else can I add?
So I just want to make one more clarifying question. The URL, the top URL you have, that's actually, you said it's experimental, but it's going to be returning ISNI in RDF?
Both URLs. The first one returns ISNI in RDF and closed in an SRU schema response. And the second returns JSON LD in the JSON LD format.
Okay. Great, thank you.
So what we, the information that's contained in ISNI consists for a large part of links to the sources of which ISNI consists, because ISNI is a sort of cooperative information system where we collect data from all sorts of contributors, from the music world, from the library world. And so a main part of the linked data contents for ISNI is links to the original sources that supplied the information to ISNI. Is that clear?
It is for me. Does anyone else have questions? So, I don't know, we have a couple people from LOC who, would one of you like to comment on yours? Actually, I see Nate here. I don't see Kevin today, so. So Nate, if you are talking, you're muted. You're not muted now, but I still don't hear you. All right, we might have to jump back to LOC because I can't hear Nate speaking. So I don't know if Barbara's on today. I don't see her. So we'll skip over anyone that's not here just for sake of time. OCLC? I don't see them on as well. All right.
I don't know if Kirk could speak to, I know he's new at OCLC, but Kirk's on the call.
Oh, yes, Kirk is on the call. Excellent.
Which one are we talking about?
Do you feel comfortable talking about the OCLC?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually not very complicated, because with a CQL query, the FAST has a RDF XML response, so that's the example that's there. And then whereas VOF doesn't, but other than that, they work kind of the same way.
So what does VF return? Because in the format column, it has RDF, XML, and JSON.
I mean, the example that's there is a JSON response. So I don't know a lot about that one.
Okay, so possibly it returns RDF, XML, but we're not sure.
I was looking around. I'd have to ask Rick, but I don't think it does. I don't know why that's different. But probably something as like an enhancement we could do. I mean, if it can do JSON, it can do anything. So.
So I don't know if Nate wants to try again talking, but if not, Kurt, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Library of Congress, because I know you have a lot of experience in that one.
Well, so I mean, there's searching and suggesting, and Kevin added Suggest 2.0, which is another document you can kind of look at. I think it's here, but basically it's a keyword query, and there are two formats: Atom, so kind of an old format, and JSON comes back as responses. We also use this thing called suggesting. Suggesting is a little more like a browse, and that's what a lot of the lookup features are using. So that's where we were talking about things are sorted alphabetically, the left anchored searching. That's where suggest works.
So is that the main difference between suggest and search? Is suggest a left anchored and search is a keyword?
Yeah, and then another one that's not on here is label searching. So label searching is kind of like a suggest, except it only returns one result or zero. It doesn't match. So it's looking for an exact match. So that's another type of search. Obviously, any kind of search API can do those different kinds of things, but this is just where there's specific URLs to use for these different types of features. And then that's there's label search there. So.
Okay.
So like if you're doing like a match, like you're trying to go through and say, oh, I want to get the URI for this name, and the name of course has been painstakingly typed in the the way the NAF looks for it. So it should be able to take it and give you an exact match on the URI.
Right. So they do actually have that in the table. So right here.
Yeah, right.
You have to have the full label in order to make a match and get a result back, and it'll only give you one result.
Yeah, and then last thing I'd say, it's not in here, because punctuation is always a problem. Sometimes the punctuation is sent in, sometimes it isn't. It's the trailing punctuation is not as sensitive. So that was one enhancement that we've worked on.
So for instance, this one ended with a dot, it would match the way.
It would match, right?
Even though you didn't put the dot on.
Right, but the fun library term, the medial punctuation, so like that comma, those are important. So if those commas aren't there, it's not going to match.
Okay. All right. Tatiana couldn't make it today either, so that we don't have anything about Share VDE. Are there anything, Georgina or Jens, that you want to say about Wikidata?
I fear we were not very well prepared. Maybe we can do something for the next call or something. Prepare something.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So part of the reason why I wanted to go through these at this point was to just sort of set the stage for what our use cases are, because I assume that all these APIs that have already been developed, they were developed for a reason, because you were trying to meet a specific need. So I wanted to sort of have people's thoughts in that use case space as we move to the part of defining use cases. So right now, as I said, we have the use case that I put in, and I can talk about that a little, and then I would like to open the floor to folks bringing up use cases that they think are important that we want to not lose sight of. So the primary use case that I put in is I am an application and it's a metadata editor. And so you have a bunch of fields, and one of the things you want to do is pull in metadata from other outside authorities. So I might want to pull in the Library of Congress subject heading or the OCLC FAST subject heading. And so I have a field to hold that information. And now what I want to do is find the particular subject heading that I'm looking for. And so the user has some keywords in place, or maybe they know pretty much what they want and they want to start typing. And so the things I'm wanting to get back from it is I want to get the primary label. And so from the search, I want to get the primary label and the URI, but I also want to get any additional information that's going to help me to make an accurate selection. And so I sort of broke this down into two sub cases because I think they both are filling the same need, but the technology behind them would be slightly different. So in the one case, we have the keyword search. And in that case, the way the indexing that it searches again is going to be structured a little differently. But I want to get back like a certain number of cases, you know, whether that be 5, 8, or 20 search results. I might also want to have the ability to get more if what I'm looking for isn't in that search results. So the sort of key concepts here is how accurately can I select? So when it's a keyword search, how the results come back, I definitely want them ranked. So I want the thing that was the best match to be identifiable as the best match. So I can present it to the user through the UI as, well, this is the best match. And so probably most likely what you're looking for. And then it will kind of go down. And then of course, I also put in there this ability to access more results. So through pagination or something like that. And the second sort of sub-use case for this generic filling in a metadata field is the left anchored. So sometimes people know pretty clearly what it is they want, and they're going to start typing from the very first word of that left anchored search, and they want to find things in that alphabetical order. And so in that case, we're not doing ranked ordering, we're doing alphabetical ordering. So that's a slightly different approach on that. But you still might want like the additional information so that if you get 2 Will Smiths right back to back, you know which one you're looking for. So that's the basic use case that I bring to the table for the work that I do. And I just wanted to open it up and see what other kind of use cases folks have. So to sort of draw out a potential use case, Kirk or Nate, speaking from the LOC side of things, you have 3 different APIs you're supporting. One is the sort of left anchor, one is a keyword, and one is the suggest. So is there particular use cases, do they fit into the use case that's already described, or do you see this as a separate use case that people were bringing to the table that brought you to develop 3 different APIs?
Nate's still not talking. So yeah, the suggest I mentioned is that 3rd use case, the left anchored search. The search API itself actually has a lot more features than was described. So perhaps that'd be something where this part could be enhanced to actually cover like the different things you can do with the ID search API. Because I think there's different use cases there. I'm trying to think of a few. I mean,
so I wonder, do you find, like, how are people actually using that? Do you find that are they trying to put it into a field in another application?
yeah, so like with the label search, so MarkEdit uses that to fill in the $0 when you're trying to enhance a record. So that's label search. I don't see that here as one of the choices, so or maybe I'm not reading these closely. Just like off the cuff. So that's where I mean, maybe it's a user or a system wants to be able to exactly match a named authority to its authority URI. So, and it's something it's more of an automated thing than a user thing. I don't think users would do this very often because you're doing it usually as a batch process. The search thing is interesting. You know, I wonder, like, that's the thing is that we have there's a lot of automated use, but they all do the same stuff. So it's like really, whereas the search API, like I mentioned, is kind of flexible. It could do a lot of stuff, but I don't think a lot of people know how to use it. So it's a good, I'm trying to think what other stuff happens frequently.
Yeah, so I
Well,
thought
like,
it was interesting where you said like the autofill with a batch process. That to me does seem like a very different process. Whereas the fill the $0 mark field to me feels like basically the same kind of use case that was described above. This is just like a variant on that same case where a user comes in, they want to fill in a particular field, and they're looking for the value to put in that field. The second one is a little different. That to me feels like a completely separate use case.
Yeah, so then I actually thought of a fourth API. So hopefully maybe Kevin listen to this, work on it. But we have these feeds that show what's changed. So every, you know, period of time, every week there's new names, and every month there's new subjects. And so people who are trying to load their systems up with this new information use those. There's like a you know, a feed, and the Atom feed that should tell you what's changed. So you can just do the deltas. You don't have to load the entire set. So that's probably something I need to add in there.
So that feels like another use case to me as well.
Yeah, right.
Update cache data.
Right.
As a baseline use case, retrieve a known concept or control vocabulary term using a consistent format across different data sets. Right? No good being able to search if you can't even retrieve the values.
Mm-hmm.
So just for clarity, Rob, are you saying, is this the use case where you have URI and you would like to get more details about that URI?
Yeah.
You say a known concept?
So yeah, exactly. So at some point, say via the update, you know, the changes API, or just having already imported the data, you know the URI for a particular concept, and you want to get the most recent version of it, and you don't want to have to write ETLs for every single different data set. So, you know, it would be great to be able to go to AAT and to LCSH and to FAST and get back to use a consistent HTTP request pattern in order to get back a consistent data format describing the different concepts in those different systems. Because yes, to bag on LC very briefly and not very seriously, when the government tries to shoot itself in the head and goes into we're not going to fund anything and we're going to spend 3 months talking about what to fund, and the LC systems go down, I don't want, you know, my catalogers at Yale to be stuck waiting for LC systems to come back up. So thus, I want to be able to get all of those concepts into a local database for searching. I don't want to have to write 16 different ETL pipelines to do that.
So another clarity on this particular use case then, are you saying this is where you have cached labels and URIs in your system, or are you saying this is a use case where you've cached all the data, the entire data set?
Yeah, caching all the data set.
Okay.
So that we can run against local APIs rather than, which are going to be faster always, rather than against remote APIs. Yeah. The same reason that meta search has failed every single time anyone has tried to do it over the past 20 years, and Google has won every single time, right? The Google style of centralize only the data that you want and search it locally.
So it feels like there's two parts to this one, because there's the local search stuff and then there's the update piece.
Yes.
So I'm going to move this one up.
And it doesn't need to be in the entire data set. It's just some portion of the data set that you care to interact with.
Okay. Are there other use cases folks can think of?
Back to the question about there was earlier there was some talk about whether batch searching was a separate use case from using a metadata interface. And I could think of one use case that's distinct where you might want to filter your results based on something other than label. I'm sorry that I don't have all my ducks in a row for this, but if I had more time, I would dig up a bunch of Wikidata documentation about the time when I had to reconcile 18th century personal names, and found that having to limit people, limit by dates was really essential, because every 18th century author seems to have an equivalent football player in who's alive today. So I guess maybe a placeholder here for filtering results by something not super specific, but date ranges or class types in cases where a resource might contain multiple, might return entities of multiple class types.
So Christina, in this case, are you trying to fill in a single field? You started off by commenting that you were talking about maybe the batch processing, where you would be filling in a whole bunch of things at once, or in this case, are you saying that I'm looking for a specific field and I need to filter out some stuff to limit my selection process?
Sorry, I'm sorry, I'm like super slow right now and I'm trying to like parse your question. I think what I'm saying is, say if you were doing a batch process, either in MarcEdit or in my case in OpenRefine, you have a single column where you're trying to do reconciliation and match hopefully against one item or several, or at least find several candidates. And in my example, I was only trying to use one data point as a way of filtering. Does that help?
Yeah, so just to sort of say that again, it sounded like you were doing this through OpenRefine, and that's what makes it a batch process.
Yeah.
And in the process of doing that, I haven't really used OpenRefine very much, so this is where I'm going to sort of need a little education on my side. Were you trying to update a single data point in the OpenRefine grid, or were you trying to update multiple fields at once and you're using some filtering to update multiples?
The only thing I was trying to change in my OpenRefine project was to find for find matches for find entities that matched one column of names. So that the only thing that's being updated is the URI for like in each row.
So I'm sort of thinking like the open refine batch processing is slightly different than like some batch processing where it would happen in background and it happens automatically, and
I mean, I think it's sort of,
one is interactive and one is kind of happening automatically, I guess is sort of the difference there.
I think in this case, it's somewhere in between where, so like, let's say for mark edit, you run a process and if there's an exact match, it draws in a URI and puts it into a $0 or $1. And when you're interacting with a metadata editor, you're interacting with each, entity one by one and selecting them. And in OpenRefine, generally, you're running a process that's similar to what happens in MarkEdit, except it's not based on exact matches, and instead it might return multiple candidates depending on what settings you've chosen. And then you may have to sort of select things after the fact. So it's sort of a weird hybrid between an immediate response and a batch process that runs in the background. Sorry if this is like way out of scope.
Well, it probably will end up being out of scope, but I would like to capture it just so we sort of have it in our minds, because I think that it has the potential to influence some choices that we make. So I don't know, you can see the notes that I wrote. I basically just tried to make a distinction between an autofill batch process that runs in background versus this sort of manual batch processing where it's interactive and you make some adjustments as you go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can I add here that I think maybe the filtering piece that Christine led with might be appropriate for either use case.
Yes, I put it up here as well.
Yep. Okay. Yep. Sorry.
Thanks, Stephen.
Because I felt that way as well, Stephen. So that's why I wanted to get that clarification, because for me, I slipped it up here to the top.
I framed it in terms of batch processes because I had an actual example here, and I also just didn't want to talk about BibFrame resource templates. But I agree. It could work. It could be necessary for multiple scenarios.
Can I ask if anyone has ever thought about using the filters as long as you don't have one single hit? So if you get multiple hits, you just try every piece of information that you have that seems appropriate to find just the single hit that you're looking for, or nothing? Because sometimes maybe a date of birth, if you look for people from the 18th century, is an appropriate extra filter, but sometimes you have a title, sometimes you have a creation role, so you can try multiple filters. Does that sound workable?
So I wonder if folks are being quiet because they haven't used them, or because they don't envision a use case. Like, is it because you don't have these things available to you now, and so you haven't made use of these kind of filters? Is it something you desire but just don't have access to?
I think most people's practical experience is with left-anchored browse, so I think it is hard to imagine this. I think me bringing up this example has a lot to do with having tinkered with reconciliation via OpenRefine and having lots of data points available. But yeah, no, I mean, I think the possibility that Hedy brings up of using other data points, whether they're like ones that are pre-formulated or
based on what you have, yeah.
Maybe. Based on the other data that's present, or I mean, I could totally see the contemporary versus non-contemporary author thing being useful in like a new book cataloging workflow, where you don't want every single person who's ever lived who's had this name, but the person who's published recently being helpful. Or the other, and then the other filter that I think has come up a number of times in the discussions about QA in the context of Sinopia, at least with the authorities that I've tried to help shepherd, was fullness of data as a filter. So, you know, which result has the most links in it, which result has the most details or the most robust data in it.
Mm-hmm. Also sounds sensible, yeah.
Now multiply that by all the possible fields that you can capture about a concept, a person, or a place. Right. So how about language? Seems like a particularly useful one. One wonderful meeting at Library of Congress that I was involved with. Someone from Denmark said, well, we always have to filter for language because Donald Duck in Danish is Anders and. So if you search for Anders and in lots of syntaxes, the and meaning duck will try to be parsed as a Boolean. And of course breaks everything very, very badly. So equally, if you wanted to search for and in Danish, it would be lovely to be able to search or filter by, or you know that your input label is in Danish. So searching for and in Danish should generate a different data set compared to searching for and in English, where you might find the names of corporations with the conjunction in the middle. And repeat, right? You know, that's one minor example. Dates are a fascinating one as well. Of course, there's date of birth, date of death, date of flourished date, active dates per profession, and so on and so forth. Different types of name, pen name, pseudonym, married name, maiden name, full name. The form of the name, is it inverted or is it the regular display form? If you know the part of the name, how do you say that? And so on and so on and so on. So
it definitely feels like when you started talking about, you know, name versus pseudonym, pseudonym, and variants, that definitely feels like a discussion in the realm of like which fields to search, because that can greatly impact what results you get back. So choosing whether or not to search across variants or not search across variants can have a big impact on the results that you get.
Exactly.
So one of the other things I put up there, because I didn't really specifically point this out when I was doing that initial use case, is extended context. So that's one of the things that we have in our current system is we pull in a bunch of additional context beyond just like the label and the URI. We bring in things like birth date and death date, occupation. Of course, that varies by authority because what data is pertinent and helps the user make a decision is going to be different from authority to authority. And so it feels a little bit like there's some overlap between, or interaction really, between the extended context and the filtering example that was given as well. And that there would need to be some consideration in how those things would play with each other and how you would pass the requests for some filtering back and forth. But that's getting into too much details, actually. I don't want to go too detailed into technology at this point, other than to gather what kinds of things people think we need. I think we already have a good set of use cases here. I'm very pleased with that. So we have that basic use case of filling in a single piece of metadata within a larger context of metadata. We have caching of metadata, or a caching of a data set, or a significant portion of a data set. We have related to that, how do you, API stuff that would help you to update cache and then also batch processing stuff. So I'm wondering if there are other use cases we need to capture, or if people feel pretty good about the set that we have right now. So I'm not hearing anything, and I take that to mean that people do feel good about the use cases. I would say, as with anything that we do, sometimes information sort of percolates through your mind across the week. So if something else comes up and you go, wow, you know, we really should have talked about this use case as well, don't hesitate to add some more information to this page. And you know, flesh it out as much as you think is necessary in order to convey your idea, and we can always talk about it at another time. We have about 9 minutes left in our hour, and I think that is excellent timing. I'm wondering, I would like to get a sense of where people think of these sets of the set of use cases that we have, where people are in terms of like what seems most important for this group to cover, because I don't think we can cover all of this. But I do think that, you know, if things go well and we're happy with this process, we could always take up some of this other stuff at another time. So I'm wondering about the best approach for doing this. We could just have an open discussion. We could do a sort of voting. I think there's just a few cases, so I don't think voting is really the way to go. So from my personal standpoint, I will open the conversation and say that the first use case is the one that I would say that if we could address that use case, that would be the biggest bang for our buck from this particular group. So I'm wondering what other people think. Are they comfortable tabling the other particular use cases that are there? There might be some influence and overlap from the other use cases into this primary use case. Where are there folks around this?
I don't think that the first use case and the search case are different. So I think it's too big an issue to bite off.
Which one being the search use case?
With filters.
The filters are part of that. So
Well,
I put that as like influencing.
Okay. I thought there was a separate one. Having been involved in search standardization for 20 years, I don't think that this is a feasible thing to do in under 2 years. And it is predicated on being able to retrieve the data consistently anyway. So if you can't solve retrieving the data when you know what it is, then searching for it is irrelevant because you can't process the stuff you get back.
Okay. So what I'm hearing, Rob, is that you think this is a really hard thing that we're trying to do. And I would say that you can't get to the end unless you take the first steps. So if we take the first steps and we get to the end of this working group and we found that we only made a small bit of progress, I would still say that that's progress that's worth making, and that we can then reflect and see where we would want to go next and see if there's any kind of influence and practical stuff that we can take out of this process. Are you advocating for one of the other topics, or just indicating that this particular use case that we're taking on is very challenging?
I think that the consistent retrieval of a known item is feasible and is a necessary first step towards fulfilling the search use case regardless. That in order to be able to search, you need to know the fields that you can search on. In order to know the fields, you need to have a format or at least a model. And in order to know the model, you need to have something consistent across institutions. So if we have something consistent across institutions, the baseline is retrieve a single to a single concept, say, using that model, and then do something with it. You know. But to jump straight into search without having any understanding of what the data is, will, I think, is skipping over some some fundamental and necessary preconditions in terms of the process.
Rob, are you suggesting that you think we could come to a shared data model across all data sets?
Well, if we can't, how are we going to search them?
Well,
When I say
maybe
Python,
a way towards getting a single data model is to at least be able to request what the data model for a particular website is. Because I don't think that's common to ask for, to ISNI, for instance, which labels can you return, and what's the contents of these labels?
yeah.
Yeah,
If we're talking about, so let's use people given ISNI, and we don't have a consistent model for the relationship between the person and their birth date. How do you search for the birth date?
Exactly. Yes.
so it's an interesting thing you've proposed, Rob. That feels like a much huger problem than, for me, that feels like a much huger problem than putting a search over the existing databases that people have. The data sets they have are what they have. And so if I want to search Library of Congress, they've represented their data however they've done it. What I need is a consistent way to access that information. So I personally don't feel like I have any ability to tell any organization how they should represent their data, or to prescribe, to do any kind of prescribing of that type of thing. So
but then if you don't, if there isn't at least an abstract model for the search, and then Getty internally has the notion of the concept of the person separate from the actual person, and LC doesn't, then now what? Now you can't have a consistent search anymore unless you have some baseline upon what you're searching, regardless of how they maintain it. That doesn't matter. It would be up to the institution to provide their own mapping internally of when, which fields internally get put into which fields of the model, and thus when a search comes in against a particular field of the model, they can translate that into their backend system. We're not saying everyone has to use a triple store to manage their data or anything like that. But what's another example? If you have date times, date spans, and one ontology allows you to have uncertain beginnings and endings, and another one is just absolute. So
right.
now,
I
we
very
have a different problem.
yeah.
But one that would be solved with a model first approach rather than an API top down and hand wave about the model approach.
Right. So we are out of time, and that is a huge discussion that you just brought up. So I think that maybe we'll punt that and have a bit of a conversation on it next time. I will end on, I'm somewhat concerned about turning this into an ontology discussion, because I think it is much harder to get people to agree on what the ontology would be than it would be to agree on the technology of how we're going to access the data we have. And if this becomes a question of, can we all agree on what it means to be a person and how we're going to represent person data, then I would absolutely agree with you that this working group, in the amount of time that we have allotted, will not be able to do that. And even if we as a working group come up with an answer to that question, getting all authorities that could possibly exist across the world to also agree with that, I think would be a substantial challenge as well. So I'm just going to put that out there as some food for thought across the time till the next time we meet. And maybe we could talk about that some more, because I think the very first step before we move farther into the working group process, there does have to be some consensus of what it is we're trying to solve. So I appreciate everyone's input, and I think the set of use cases we have defined are good, and we'll just take on this sort of nitty-gritty conversation that we've kind of ended with. We'll take it on next time. All right, thanks everybody.
Thanks all.
Thank you. Bye-bye then.